The year was 1931, and high in the Colorado Rockies, a railroad was dying. The Rio Grande Southern had once been the industrial artery of the San Juan Mountains, hauling silver ore and timber through some of the most treacherous terrain in North America. Now, with the mines shuttered and the Great Depression strangling what remained of the mountain economy, every mile of track had become a financial wound that refused to heal. Steam locomotives, those magnificent iron horses that had conquered the American West, were bleeding the company dry. Each run required a crew of 5 men, tons of coal, thousands of gallons of water, and hours of maintenance before and after every trip. The revenue from hauling mail and the occasional passenger barely covered the fuel bill, let alone the wages. The railroad's accountants had done the math 100 times, and the answer was always the same. They were spending dollars to earn dimes. So when a mechanic named Jack Odenbaugh wheeled out a battered Buick sedan that had been hacked apart and bolted to a set of rail wheels, the locals did exactly what you would expect. They laughed. They called it a car on rails. They said it looked like something a child might build from spare parts and wishful thinking. The railroad men who had spent their careers tending to massive steam engines could not believe anyone was serious about sending this automotive monstrosity up into the mountains. What none of them understood was that this ridiculous contraption was about to do something the mightiest locomotives in the fleet could not. It was about to save an entire railroad, and with it, the mountain communities that depended on those rails for their very survival. This is the story of the Galloping Goose, and it begins with a set of ledgers that read like a death certificate. Victor Miller sat in the receiver's office in 1931, staring at financial statements that offered no hope and no alternatives. The Rio Grande Southern had been placed in receivership, which meant a court-appointed manager now controlled every dollar that flowed in and out of the company. Miller's job was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. He had to find a way to keep the railroad running long enough to either sell it or return it to profitability. The numbers suggested neither outcome was likely. The railroad's problems were not mysterious, they were mathematical. A single steam locomotive run required an engineer at the throttle, a fireman to shovel coal and manage the boiler, a conductor to handle passengers and paperwork, and 2 brakemen to work the manual brakes on the cars. 5 men, 5 salaries, 5 sets of expenses, all to haul what often amounted to a few bags of mail and 3 or 4 passengers willing to pay for the mountain crossing. The coal bill alone was staggering. Steam engines of that era were not efficient machines. They converted only a fraction of the fuel's energy into actual movement, with the rest escaping as heat, smoke, and waste. Water consumption was equally brutal. Boilers needed constant replenishment, and water stops along the route added time and complexity to every run. Maintenance never ended. Steam locomotives were mechanical nightmares, with hundreds of moving parts that wore out, broke down, and required constant attention from skilled workers. Miller issued an order that cut through every department like a blade. 30% reduction in all expenses, no exceptions, no appeals. Crews were slashed. Maintenance was deferred to the point of danger. The roundhouse, once alive with the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam, fell silent for days at a time. Locomotives sat cold on the sidings, their fireboxes dark, their boilers drained. But one thing could not be cut, no matter how desperate the situation became. The mail contract with the United States government was the railroad's last remaining source of reliable income. Miss a single delivery, and the Interstate Commerce Commission would begin abandonment proceedings. Once those proceedings started, the rails themselves would be torn up and sold for scrap. The towns along the route would lose their only connection to the outside world, and the Rio Grande Southern would vanish from history. The equation was brutal in its simplicity. Running steam trains cost more than the mail contract paid. Not running trains meant losing the contract entirely. The railroad was caught in a financial trap with no visible escape, spending itself into oblivion while the alternative was immediate death. To understand why the mail contract mattered so much, you have to understand what the railroad meant to the towns it served. Telluride, Rico, Ophir, and a dozen other communities scattered through the San Juan Mountains were not connected to the outside world by anything except steel rails. The wagon roads, such as they were, became impassable for months at a time during winter. Telephone lines failed regularly, torn down by wind and ice. The nearest major city was days away by any route that did not involve a train. Everything these towns needed to survive arrived by rail. Flour for bread, canned goods for the winter months when fresh food was impossible to obtain, medicine for the sick and injured, currency for the banks, coal for heating, clothing, tools, equipment, newspapers, letters from family members who had moved away to find work. All of it came on the trains, packed into mail sacks and freight cars, delivered on a schedule that the mountains themselves seemed determined to disrupt. When the train did not arrive, the consequences were immediate and personal. Store shelves emptied. The doctor rationed pills and bandages. Miners waiting for their pay had to explain to their families that the money had not come through yet. Children watched the tracks, hoping to hear the distant echo of a whistle that meant the world had not forgotten them. The mail was more than correspondence. In 1931, before electronic banking and instant communication, the Postal Service was the circulatory system of American commerce. Government relief checks traveled through the mail. Business payments cleared through the mail. The difference between a family eating and a family going hungry often came down to whether a single envelope arrived on time. The railroad understood this, and so did the government. The mail contract existed precisely because there was no alternative. If the Rio Grande Southern stopped running, the towns of the San Juan Mountains would be cut off from civilization. In the depths of the Depression, with no resources to build new roads and no money to subsidize alternative transportation, abandonment of the railroad meant abandonment of the communities it served. Jack Odenbaugh was not a railroad executive. He was not an engineer with university credentials. He was a mechanic, a man who understood machines the way a surgeon understands anatomy, through years of hands-on work with metal and grease, and the stubborn physics of moving parts. When the orders came down to find a cheaper way to move the mail, Odenbaugh did not consult textbooks or commission studies. He walked out to the yard and looked at what was available. What he found was a 1926 Buick Master 6, a luxury automobile that had seen better days. The car was headed for salvage, worth more as parts than as transportation. But Odenbaugh saw something else. He saw an engine that ran on gasoline instead of coal. He saw a vehicle light enough to cross aging bridges and navigate deteriorating track. He saw the possibility of moving the mail with one man instead of five. The conversion process was brutal improvisation. Odenbaugh and his crew kept the Buick's engine, dashboard, and front seat. The steering wheel was removed entirely because there was no need for it. Rails do not offer the option of turning left or right. The rear of the car was cut away and replaced with a steel frame that could carry mail and small freight. The road wheels were pulled off and replaced with flanged steel wheels machined to fit the narrow gauge track of the Rio Grande Southern. Weight distribution was critical. A vehicle too heavy in front would dive into curves and stress the front trucks. Too heavy in the rear, and the drive wheels would lose traction on the steep mountain grades. Odenbaugh spent hours adjusting the balance, adding counterweights, testing different configurations until the converted Buick sat level on the rails. The braking system required complete redesign. Automobile brakes of that era were designed to stop a vehicle weighing a few thousand pounds on rubber tires with high friction. Rail wheels on steel track had almost no friction by comparison. Odenbaugh adapted locomotive brake components, rigging a system that could slow the machine on the mountain descents without overheating or failing. The cow catcher at the front was not decorative. It was cut from boilerplate salvaged from a retired locomotive, heavy enough to sweep debris and small animals from the track, angled to deflect rocks and deadfall rather than catching them under the wheels. The whole assembly looked exactly like what it was, a desperate hybrid born of necessity and salvage. The cost, when the final invoice was tallied, came to $850. That was less than the railroad spent running a single steam locomotive for 1 week. If the contraption worked, it would pay for itself before the end of the month. Gasoline engines in 1931 were not the refined machines we know today. The Buick Straight Six that powered the first Galloping Goose was a flathead design, meaning the valves were located in the engine block beside the pistons rather than in the cylinder head above them. This configuration was simpler to manufacture and maintain but less efficient than overhead valve designs. It produced roughly 60 horsepower, enough to move a loaded sedan down a paved highway at respectable speeds. The challenge was adapting that power to railroad work. Automobile transmissions were designed for relatively flat roads with occasional hills. The Rio Grande Southern featured grades as steep as 4%, meaning the track rose 4 feet for every 100 feet of horizontal distance. These were grades that challenged powerful steam locomotives. Asking a Buick engine to haul a loaded mail car up those inclines required careful gearing. Odenbaugh's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He retained the automobile's original transmission, but added a chain reduction drive between the gearbox output and the rail wheels. This reduction gearing multiplied the engine's torque at the cost of top speed. The Galloping Goose would never win any races, but it could crawl up grades that would have stalled an unmodified car within seconds. The suspension system was another critical adaptation. Automobile suspensions are designed to absorb the irregularities of road surfaces, which are relatively minor compared to the gaps, joints, and misalignments found in railroad track. Odenbaugh mounted the rail trucks on pivot points that allowed them to follow the track through sharp curves, while the body of the vehicle remained relatively stable. This articulation was essential for the tight mountain curves of the Rio Grande Southern, where a rigid vehicle would have derailed constantly. Weight became the Goose's greatest advantage. Steam locomotives of comparable pulling power weighed hundreds of tons. Their massive iron wheels and heavy running gear pounded the track with every revolution, accelerating wear on rails, ties, and bridges that the railroad could no longer afford to maintain. The Galloping Goose, fully loaded, weighed approximately 6 tons. It glided over the aging infrastructure rather than battering it into submission. The operating economics told the real story. One man could drive the Goose, handle the mail, and collect tickets from the handful of passengers who rode in the converted rear compartment. Fuel consumption was measured in gallons per trip rather than tons per trip. Maintenance could be performed by any mechanic familiar with automobile engines, a skill set far more common than the specialized knowledge required to maintain steam locomotives. The first winter tested everything. Snow in the San Juan Mountains does not fall gently. It arrives in massive dumps, piling feet of accumulation overnight, drifting into cuts, and across exposed track until the rails disappear entirely. Steam locomotives handle deep snow by sheer mass, their weight crushing through drifts that would stop lighter equipment. The Galloping Goose had no such advantage. Odenbaugh had anticipated the problem. He mounted a flanger blade beneath the frame, a steel wedge that rode just above the rail surface, scraping away snow and ice before it could accumulate to dangerous depths. In moderate conditions, the flanger kept the track clear enough for passage, but moderate conditions were rare in the high country winter. When the snow exceeded what the flanger could handle, there was only one option. The driver stopped the Goose, climbed out into the freezing wind, grabbed the shovel stored behind his seat, and dug. Mile after mile, drift after drift, one man against the mountain winter. There were no relief crews waiting, no backup locomotives standing by. If the driver could not clear the track, the mail did not move. Derailments were a regular occurrence. The track of the Rio Grande Southern had been laid decades earlier, and maintenance had been deferred for years before the receivership made it nearly impossible. Rails spread under summer heat and contracted under winter cold. Frost heaves lifted sections of track out of alignment. Wooden ties rotted beneath the steel. A driver might round a curve and feel the sickening lurch as the wheels left the rails, the Goose tilting at an angle that suggested imminent disaster. The solution sat in the equipment bay. An 8-ton portable jack, carried on every run, could lift the derailed vehicle high enough to manhandle the wheels back onto the track. The process was exhausting, dangerous, and time-consuming, but it worked. A driver who derailed in the morning could often have the Goose back on the rails and completing the run by afternoon. There is a document in the historical archives, a simple telegraph exchange, that captures everything the Galloping Goose meant to the communities it served. The telegraph at Rico tapped out a question to the dispatcher at Ridgeway. "Train delayed?" The reply came from the postmaster's log rather than the railroad office. Motor arrived on time. All mail delivered. That single exchange represented survival. The general store in Rico restocked its shelves. The doctor's office received the medications that kept patients alive through the winter. A child opened a letter from a father who had gone to Denver looking for work. The first word from him in weeks. The mail was through. The connection held. The Goose's horn became the sound of hope in towns that had little else to hope for. That ridiculous honking, so different from the majestic whistle of a steam locomotive, announced that the outside world still remembered these mountain communities existed. It meant paychecks and pension checks and packages from relatives in warmer places. It meant that despite everything, the railroad was still running. The success of the first Galloping Goose guaranteed that it would not remain alone. The Ridgeway shop immediately began work on additional vehicles, each one incorporating lessons learned from the original. Goose number 2 used a Pierce Arrow limousine as its donor vehicle, a luxury automobile far beyond the means of anyone in the Depression-ravaged mountains. The straight 8 engine offered more power than the Buick, and the longer wheelbase provided a more stable platform. Successive Geese grew increasingly sophisticated. Enclosed mail compartments kept parcels dry in rain and snow. Reinforced freight beds could handle heavier cargo. Longer bodies eventually required a third truck to navigate the tight mountain curves without binding. Aluminum bus bodies on the later models reduced weight while increasing passenger capacity. By 1933, the shop records show Goose number 5 costing $2,599, more than 3 times the price of the original. but every dollar represented capability that kept the railroad solvent. More power for steeper grades, better suspension for rougher track, larger capacity for the mail contracts that kept the money flowing. The fleet eventually numbered 7 vehicles, though not all were in service at any given time. Some were held in reserve for maintenance. Others were cannibalized for parts when supplies became impossible to obtain. The Geese represented a rolling catalog of Depression-era ingenuity, each one a unique solution to the problem of keeping a railroad alive when everything said it should be dead. The Rio Grande Southern finally ceased operations in 1952, outliving dozens of other narrow-gauge railroads that had succumbed to automobiles and highways. The Galloping Geese had bought the railroad 2 decades of survival, 2 decades of mail delivered, and communities connected, 2 decades beyond what anyone thought possible in 1931. But the Geese themselves refused to die. Today, these remarkable machines survive in numbers that would astonish their creators. Goose number 2 operates at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, carrying passengers on summer excursions. Goose number 5 runs special trips from Dolores, offering visitors the chance to ride the same vehicle that once hauled mail through blizzards. Goose number 3 somehow ended up at Knott's Berry Farm in California, rattling past roller coasters in a setting utterly unlike the Colorado mountains. Even Goose number 1, scrapped before the railroad closed, has been resurrected as a faithful replica at Ridgeway. These machines, built from desperation and salvage, have become treasured artifacts of American railroad history. Museums polish them and protect them. Tourists photograph them and ride them. Historians write books about them. The contraption that everyone laughed at in 1931 is now celebrated as a masterpiece of practical engineering. The lesson of the Galloping Goose is not really about railroads or automobiles or the specific engineering challenges of mountain transportation. It is about what happens when conventional solutions fail and survival depends on thinking differently. When Victor Miller looked at the Rio Grande Southern's ledgers in 1931, he saw a railroad that could not afford to run and could not afford to stop. Every existing option led to failure. The steam locomotives were too expensive to operate. Shutting down meant losing the mail contract. Abandonment meant the end of the communities the railroad served. The problem, defined in conventional terms, had no solution. Jack Odenbaugh did not solve the problem Miller saw. He solved a different problem. Instead of asking how to make steam operations profitable, he asked how to move the mail for less money than the contract paid. The answer was sitting in the salvage yard, waiting for someone to see its potential. Every generation faces challenges that seem impossible within the existing framework. Supply chains strain and break. Communities lose their connections to the broader world. Technologies that once represented progress become anchors dragging institutions toward failure. The voices of expertise explain why nothing can be done, why the constraints are too severe, why the math simply does not work. Those explanations are usually correct within their assumptions, but the assumptions themselves are often the real constraint. The Rio Grande Southern's accountants were right that steam operations could not be made profitable. They were wrong that steam operations were the only option. Somewhere right now in a workshop or a garage or a corner office, someone is looking at a problem everyone says cannot be solved. They are ignoring the laughter of the experts and the skepticism of the conventional thinkers. They are building something that looks ridiculous, something that violates every rule of how things are supposed to work. And they might just be building the thing that saves everything. What does your industry laugh at today that might be the only thing keeping it alive tomorrow? What assumptions have you accepted as constraints that might actually be choices? The Galloping Goose looked absurd because it refused to be bound by what a railroad vehicle was supposed to look like. Its creators cared about function, not form. They cared about survival, not tradition. That battered, honking machine hauled more than mail through the Colorado mountains. It hauled a reminder that the answers to impossible problems often hide in plain sight, disguised as jokes, dismissed as fantasies, waiting for someone desperate enough or creative enough to take them seriously.